like, you know, you suck it with a straw, right? It's like a big balloon. There's just a bunch of oil there, kind of like you have a bottle of vegetable oil, and you kind of pump it out. And whether, you know, we wish that were the case. It's not like that at all. What you have, as you mentioned, are rocks that have different degrees of what are called porosity and permeability. So you'll have oil that's in these rocks of all these intricate patterns that can the oil can flow through the rocks and you can get them out. But it can be really tricky to do so because it's not just giving you a pool. And this is why historically, if you take any given reservoir of oil, people have only been able to get 10% of the oil out of it because it's not just this pool that you suck with a straw. It's got all these other physical characteristics. And the whole history of energy extraction as far as oil goes has been how do we get a larger and larger percentage of that? And that's true also of gas. So in the same areas that you have oil, often you'll have what's called natural gas, which is hydrogen and carbon atoms that are in the form of a gas that you can burn. And it actually burns very cleanly, and you can use that to generate electricity or to heat up homes. So it's great stuff, but it can be hard to get. Now the revolution with fracking is there's a type of rock that's not very porous and not very permeable. And so historically, we haven't been able to get much from it. This has been one of the hardest problems in the history of energy extraction. It's called the shale problem. So shale, it's a type of rock that has a lot of energy locked inside it, but it's useless to us because it's just too hard to get up. It's too tightly compacted together, and the only way people historically could get it was to heat it up using an insane amount of energy to get oil. But if you use an insane amount of energy to get oil, well, it's a problem, right? Because you use more energy than you get out. So the question is, how do you get out the energy while using less energy as your input? And fracking is a solution. It's not the final solution, but it's a major, major solution to this problem, particularly with getting gas. So what they do is they use a certain way of drilling called horizontal drilling, where you think of a well as vertical, but now we have wells that can go like this and go like this. And this drilling horizontally for various physical reasons allows you to then, once you have a horizontal well, you can then use very, very, very high pressure water to fracture it. It's called hydraulic fracturing, is the real name for fracking. To fracture it and to open it up. So you're making, even though the rock is not normally porous and permeable, you're making it that way. So you sort of blast it, like you create all these fractures. But that's not enough, because if you just did that, then they would just sort of collapse upon itself. So what they do is they put in usually sand or something else to prop it open. So it's like you're fracturing it, and then you shoot sand in it, and then through the sand, you can get the gas and the oil. So the gas and the oil can sort of propagate through the sand and through those cracks where it couldn't before. Now, this is really cool, because you're turning something that used to be just this rock that you couldn't get anything from, and now you're turning it into something similar to the easier kinds of rock that we get in nature. And there's tons and tons and tons of shale. So we don't know what the limits of this technology are, but already people are talking about how this is giving us 100 years of gas supplies at current rates. And this is only a couple of years into the modern fracking technology. So this is something that if we think about the world energy, and this is something that can be used not just in the US, but in Canada, all kinds of other places around the world. This is something that has the potential to create massive, massive, massive amounts of new cheap energy, and also, which should be a concern, it's energy in America. So this is energy that is very secure, and that people can make a lot of money off in America creating it. So in the most kind of famous region right now is in North Dakota, where they're using fracking to get especially a lot of oil. There's a region called the Bakken. And a friend of mine, actually, who's from CFACT, he sent me a copy of a 1981 textbook where they showed like how much oil there is various places, and it showed none in North Dakota. Like there is none. And now it's like the third or fourth leading state, and it may become the leading state. And one of the guys who's led that revolution claims that it's even far, far more than we think now. He proclaims America is going to be the next Saudi Arabia of oil. Now, we can't know this for sure, but this is the guy who's had the best track record so far. So this is an amazing technology. And as far as the economics go, who knows what the unemployment rate is in North Dakota?
4%?
Too high.
Is it like one of the lowest?
Yeah, it's 3.5, so it's by far the lowest. So if you go to North Dakota and you turn on the radio, you're just going to be bombarded by ads for jobs, which is not usually a problem in, I imagine in New York, it's certainly not a problem in California, where we have a well over 10% unemployment rate. So fracking is a revolutionary form of energy extraction. It's a means of taking immense amounts of energy that used to be useless and making them useful. Now, what is the objection that you hear most often to fracking? Someone besides you know everything.
Wouldn't it possibly be near some national parks and you're hurting the wildlife?
That's one objection, although that applies to any form of energy.
Groundwater contamination?
Yeah, so groundwater contamination is the most common objection, and it's important to address this kind of objection. But I want to go back to the what's called the Occupy Wall Street, because this is what they were obsessed with. They had no idea what fracking was. They didn't know what it did, how it worked, why it mattered. The one thing they knew, they quote unquote knew, was that it poisons water, or that it's bad for water. So I would go up to them and I'd talk to them. They'd say, hey, I actually think fracking is good. They'd say, like, what do you mean? Fracking messes up the water. How dare you? Like, and the reason I bring this up is because this is a really common form of argument that's going to come up in the elections over and over and over. And it's this idea that if something has any kind of problems with it, that means it's bad and we should ban it. So if something has any kind of problems with it, it's bad and we should ban it. So all these people think they needed to know was that in some place, somehow, some natural gas got into some body of water and therefore we should just scrap the whole enterprise. But this is not a responsible way of thinking at all. And there's an example I like to use. Let's see. Especially for those who claim that we need to replace fossil fuels with other things. So I'm going to read you a couple quotes about a certain form of energy. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I want you to think as you listen to these quotes, does this prove that this energy is bad? Does this prove that we should get rid of it? Excuse me, coughing. On the outskirts of one of China's most polluted cities, an old farmer stares despairingly out across an immense lake of bubbling toxic waste covered in black dust. He remembers it as fields of wheat and corn. These people only care about money. They have destroyed our lives. Hidden out of sight behind smoke-shrouded factory complexes in the city of Batao, and patrolled by platoons of security guards, lies a 5-mile-wide tailing lake. It has killed farmland for miles around, made thousands of people ill, and put one of China's key waterways in jeopardy. This vast, hissing cauldron of chemicals is the dumping ground for 7 million tons a year of fill in the blank, after it has been doused in acid and chemicals and processed through red-hot furnaces to extract its components. Now, this is actually the mild part of the narrative. I couldn't find the more gory part, but what the more gory part talks about is the local village. I mean, it's really sad, actually. I mean, people are getting hair loss, their bones are softening, there are all kinds of things being passed on to children. So let me ask, I mean, does this story prove that this form of energy is bad?
No,
Why not?
because like what you said, it's a problem. It's not proof that ubiquitously this industry.
Well, so how would you approach it as a problem? Would you just say, okay, let all these Chinese people get sick, I don't care?
No. Would it be a question of law saying if this makes people sick, then you can't do it, or it would be a question of how do you dispose these things?
Yeah, so that sounds like a kind of, that sounds like an instance of the kind of, what do we generally do when we have a problem in life? What is our general impulse? Yeah, solve it. But this never comes up in energy. So anytime people talk about a problem in energy, it's always, oh, it's a problem, then we should just give up the energy. Well, the energy is what makes the difference between you and someone who lives to 30. So that's not an option. So if there's a problem with some form of energy associated, the first thing we should think about is how do we solve the problem, not this justifies scrapping this form of energy. So the form of energy that I was just describing was the type of energy that's used to make windmills. If anyone, so-called green energy. It in fact involves incredibly toxic elements. But this doesn't mean, yes?
What was the fill in the blank that they were dumping there?
Oh, it's called rare earth metals. I just didn't want to tip you off.
Sure.
Okay, so but these are used in solar panels and in wind turbines. And I'm not a fan of green energy only because it's not economically competitive. But if we see this, we shouldn't say, oh, this means it's bad to make windmills. It means that, well, China probably doesn't have proper laws about the things. And there should be a better legal framework to prevent this sort of thing. So the same thing is true with something like fracking. If there's any issue with groundwater contamination, that should be addressed by rational laws. But to determine if something is good or bad, we have to look at the full context of both what are the negatives and what are the positives. And if there are problems, we have to look for solutions. And even if there aren't solutions, because there's no solution that can make anything perfectly safe or generate no waste at all. Even when that's the case, we still need to look at the full context. And the full context of any practical form of energy today is that humans desperately need more and more of it. So I believe coal, oil, natural gas, certainly via fracking, nuclear, these are all profoundly good and necessary things. And our approach to any negatives should be, as much as possible, how do we minimize them? But where we can't minimize them, then we need to accept them or adapt to them or work forward to improvements in the future. So an example I like to give is in England in the 1800s, when the coal revolution was beginning. This was something that was making life much, much better. People were moving off the farm, they were moving into factories. Those people were moving into conditions that would make us completely horrified. And if we saw what they were going through, we would say, you cannot possibly allow the amount of coal smoke that's in these people's lives. And it's true today, we could not possibly allow that amount of coal smoke. But it was necessary back then because they didn't have the wealth and the technology to deal with it. But because they were allowed to have that amount of coal smoke then, because that was better than life on the farm, what they could do is they could evolve to cleaner forms of coal, to taking coal plants out of the house and putting them far away so that you don't breathe in the smoke. And over time now we can have greater and greater safety standards. So over time in a technological society, your threshold for pollution and safety can get to continually higher standard. But at no point can you justify banning energy that's completely vitally necessary in the name of, oh, it pollutes, oh, there's waste. Because everything has waste. Human beings have waste. Human beings carry disease. That doesn't mean that we should be outlawed. So I would say watch out for this category of argument, which is it has problems, therefore it's bad. And the real solution to this argument is to really understand why the thing is good and to really stress that. So when I talk to the people on Occupy, I talked to a guy, I'm going to post this video soon actually, who was wearing a gas mask, saying fossil fuels were bad and stuff. And they're killing people, and he's dressed up as a Grim Reaper. I gave him an explanation of, even though he wasn't allowed to talk because he had this gas mask on, I gave him an explanation of how, well, thanks to natural gas and other fossil fuels, we've actually in the past 30 or 40 years doubled the amount of crops that human beings can grow, and therefore billions of people owe their lives to the fact that we have fertilizers that are based on natural gas, and we have tractors and other machines based on oil. And without those, billions of people couldn't be alive. And his response was revealing. He said he was tired of me talking about humans and how I should be more concerned with other species. And I told him I cared by far the most about humans, and that was a sticking point for him. But it's a powerful thing to realize what the positive is, and it's a trap that I see people on the right often get into, where the left will just say, oh, it has this problem, this problem, this problem, and you sort of try to say, oh, no, it doesn't, nothing can ever, don't worry. But what they're attacking is something that's primarily a solution, which is it's the solution to human life, the solution to the energy problem. So the more you see energy as a positive, as a solution in life generally, the easier it is to make the case for freedom. Now I should say, just in terms of a detail about fracking and groundwater, in case this ever comes up, I mentioned that you're getting energy from this form of very dense rock. Well, the very dense rock is actually many thousands of feet below the water. So you've got like the water table up here where the groundwater is, and then you've got the shale rock here. So the idea that this is inherently dangerous to groundwater is completely false. What can happen though, and this can happen with any form of energy basically, is it can get spilled into local water. So you can get, just like in the green energy story I just told you, toxic chemicals get spilled into water. Well, if you make a faulty natural gas well, then some of this stuff can spill into the water table. So imagine you have a pipe going down and the pipe is leaky at the point of the water, well then it's going to get in the water. And again, the way to address this is by having proper laws, is by being solution oriented. But it's certainly not to say, oh, this is dangerous for water, therefore we should ban it. I mean, that is an incredibly, incredibly irresponsible attitude. And just on the issue of water, it's because of fossil fuels in the last 20 years, 1.6 billion people have groundwater, have clean water that didn't. So to claim to care, if you care about water, number one thing you need to be in favor of is more cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And this is actually also true for climate. People say, oh, I care so much about the climate, that's why I'm against our source of 90% of energy. Well, how much climate affects your life is not primarily a function of what the average global mean temperature anomaly happens to be. It's what is your capacity to adapt to the climate and the weather. And the more energy you have, the more air conditioning you can have, the more sturdy homes you can have, the more irrigation you can have. And I read a study recently in a book called Climate Coup, which is a really good book. I interviewed the author on my radio show. And it turns out that climate-related deaths in the last 80 years, where the temperature has gone up by 1 degree, which is supposedly so alarming, climate-related deaths are down by 98%. So if you actually care about climate and human life, you should embrace fossil fuels. And incidentally, if you really care about CO2 emissions, then you should really embrace nuclear power, which incidentally, the people who claim to care most about CO2 emissions, the green movement, those are the most vehement opponents of nuclear power. And those are the ones who make it very, very hard to build and quite expensive to build. The broader, fracking itself, hopefully you see, is a really cool form of energy extraction. But more broadly, energy extraction is completely essential to life. So the thing I hope that you just carry away is that decades of your life, and then happiness within those decades, all of those completely depend on our ability to extract energy. So anytime someone attacks it, that's the context that you have to bring in. And if they try to say it has problems, therefore it's bad and we should ban it, I mean, that is a really, really dangerous sort of fallacy. If we believe that fallacy, if the man who discovered fire had believed that, he would have said, oh, well, I'm not going to create fire because it has smoke. And the smoke could make me sick 50 years down the line. Of course, you would have never gotten 50 years down the line because you wouldn't have had fire. And it's the same thing true. Modern fire is being put out by people who claim to care about the smoke. Now, in the question period, you can ask me what they really care about, because I don't believe they care about smoke. I think they're just against fire. So yeah, I'll end with that, and let's have some questions.
Yes. Yeah. I'm from Syracuse, so I've heard a lot of the fracking debate. I had people tell me two things, which I'd just like to hear your opinion on. One, that the chemicals they shoot down to the rocks, they can't process it, and no one will take it. So
Who can't process it?
that the oil or the natural gas companies they can't do anything with it, and no one wants to take it and store it. And the second thing is that it's extremely disruptive to frack because you use acres of land and you have to basically like scoop out the size of hills and stuff like that size.
The second one I can address, because I don't think that's fracking, or they're very confused, because fracking, I mentioned that it involves horizontal drilling. So the more horizontally you can go, the smaller patch of land you need to drill from, because you can have one central drilling area that can spread out in all kinds of different directions instead of having patches of vertical wells. So they may be talking about tar sands, which is a different form of technology, which is also a very cool technology that they object to. They may be talking about certain forms of
The person seems somewhat hysterical.
But in any case, I mean, the solution to this kind of thing is really to have as much private property as you can, and that way people can decide with their own property, do I want to have fracking on it? Do I want to just let it sit there for the heck of it? Which is what most environmentalists want with property. But I would like to